Hello. How's it going?
Hello. I am doing great. How are you doing?
Oh man, I'm good. I've had a busy weekend, but I'm just sitting down to record with you. I've got some fresh tea. I've got all my materials open. I'm ready to go. Yes, feeling good.
All right. Well, I am super excited to get into our conversation today because I texted you about this a little while back. Even as somebody with a Master of Divinity degree, one of the things that's always rolling around in the back of my mind is questions about the different kinds of translations. And one of the
Mm.
frustrations that I always have with them is that most people that I talk to who have any kind of thoughts about translations generally have a very strong, strident opinion about the right translation.
Yes,
You know what I'm saying?
I do.
And so I would like to have a conversation just to kind of hash out a little bit what translations are all about, how they come about, and kind of your thoughts on translations. But I think we need to phone a friend.
Yes, we really do, because if we're going to talk translations, I can't do that without my translation partner, Jon Clemence. Well, I am super excited to have my college roommate, Jon Clemence, my translation partner, my game playing buddy, my go-to guy on the podcast today. Jon, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Josh, it is a pleasure to be on such a wonderful podcast. I'm excited to talk with you guys.
Yes, both people who are listening are thrilled to hear that you are here, Jon. But before we jump into some questions, can you guys share a little bit of your background with the Bible and biblical languages? Because you are the perfect people for me to ask some of these questions to, but nobody else knows why. And I would love for you to just share kind of the ways in which you engage with the Bible and the original languages and all of that.
Yeah, so at least on the podcast, I've mentioned many times that Jon and I meet regularly to translate together. But what's my overall experience? Jon and I learned Greek together way back in college with Dr. Rodney Reeves, who is mentioned quite frequently on this podcast. And me personally, I learned Greek way back then, and then I did not keep up with it after college. And I always wanted to, and I always felt guilty that I wasn't staying up with my Greek, as many people who learn Greek either in college or seminary feel. And so when I got to go back to seminary 15 years after I graduated college, I was committed. I said, I am not going to lose these languages. I must make it a part of my life to translate regularly. I love this. I want this. So that's been my goal. And thankfully, Jon has very similar goals. And I reached out to him and said, hey, I want to make sure that as I reacquire Greek and as I acquire Hebrew for the first time, I want to translate regularly with you so that we can both keep our skills fresh. And so I would put myself very squarely in the hobbyist camp. I am by no means a language scholar. I am just a lover of biblical languages that wants to make sure I'm always learning, studying, and growing in the biblical languages. And so, so Jon and I meet twice a week, once for Greek, once for Hebrew, and we just translate. We've been working through various books of the Bible, and we just keep plugging along and trying to learn as much as we can as we go. That's been at least my experience.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. And just to give people an idea of what does hobbyist mean? So Josh Clemence, you may remember that I ran cross country and track in college when we were there. Maybe you remember that. Maybe you don't. I don't know.
I do indeed. As a matter of fact, the only thing I can picture you in, John, this is 100% true. The only thing I can picture you in is a cross country uniform.
Good. I probably shouldn't wear one right now, but I appreciate that.
It wasn't great then. Let's just be honest.
No, it really wasn't. We're all glad we're past that. But to the point, I ran competitively in college and a little bit afterwards. I was better than most people at running. I could go to any local road race and be in the top 5, if not win. I was not even in the running, pun intended, to get to the Olympic Games, right? So like that's kind of where we sit. Like, yeah, we're better than most people because we practice it, but we are in a different league than, for example, the scholars who gave us our modern biblical translations. So just to put that out there is like better than average, way worse than the pros, if that makes sense.
Totally does. But the thing that I love about this word hobbyist is that it means you do it for the love of the thing, right? And there is something incredible about knowing that a hobbyist is a person who spends lots of time on the thing. You didn't spend a minimal amount of time on running. You spent a lot of time on running. And the same is now true of biblical languages. So, for example, John, can you list off some of the chunks that you guys have translated together?
Well, let's see. Just recently, we're working through the book of Matthew. So we are on chapter 21, if I remember. And so the whole book. We recently translated the entire book of Esther, all of Genesis 1 through 11. We're working through Psalms right now. We're doing a selection of Psalms. So that's what we've been working on the past year.
That's incredible. So this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you guys. Who better to talk about a translation than two guys who don't do it professionally, which is really just a way of saying they don't do it because they get paid to. They do it because they love the thing. And so they make time in their busy lives to continually get better at this. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for having this conversation. I am so excited to dig into this with both of you guys. So let me just start off with kind of the biggest, broadest question, which is, why on earth are there so many translations out there?
I don't know is my answer. I don't know. I don't know if John has an answer. Here's my best take on it. There are so many different approaches to translating. And so are you going to bring across an exact word for word? Are you going to bring across a thought for thought? Are you going to bring across more of a paraphrase where it's more like larger thought by larger thought? And what lens are you going to bring to that translation? There's so many variables about how to translate that it ultimately allows for a lot of different translations because people are going to bring a slightly different approach in every single one. That's my best take. What about you, John?
Yeah. So what if I gave an example? Let's just kind of take an example to show. Josh from Oregon, we just translated Psalm 62. I think we got done a couple of weeks ago. And so if you remember the first verse in Psalm 62, in the Hebrew, if you literally translate it word for word, it says, "Surely to God, silence, my soul, from him, my salvation." What do you do with that? There's no verbs. It's just a smattering of words like strewn about the page. And that to me is a perfect example of why you get different translations. Because someone is going to say, well, I want my translation to be as word for word precise as I can make it, because that's important to me. Someone else says, well, I actually want the thought behind the verse to be the most important thing. So I'm going to reword it slightly in English to get that thought across. So you've immediately got two different translation philosophies, which are going to lead to two different translations. And it's not that one of those is right or wrong. It's just that when you're faced with an example like this, where it's Hebrew poetry, it's hard to understand, it's purposefully omitting words to hit a meter, you have to make these decisions, and we don't all make decisions in the same way. We don't all value things in the same way. And that's why we end up with these different translations.
So I'm super interested in this example. Can you talk us through kind of what the translation might look like in those kind of two main camps that you described?
So let's take a look, for example. So New American Standard, I'm just going to grab that one as an example. That's very much a word-for-word translation. So when I was learning Greek and Hebrew, that's the translation I used a bunch because I could check my work basically a lot easier. So for NASB, the way they treat this is they say, "My soul waits in silence for God only. From him is my salvation." So they kind of have to supply, okay, we think that the general idea here is waiting. And so we're going to kind of put that word in, but the rest of it is pretty close. But now let's just go to the way other end of the extreme and look at the message, right? That's much more of almost bordering upon like a paraphrase as opposed to a true translation. And that's Eugene Peterson, as you guys know. And he says, "God, the one and only, I'll wait as long as he says. Everything I need comes from him, so why not?" So those are very different translations. Again, the NASB is trying to preserve those words as they are written, whereas Eugene Peterson is saying, okay, what's the heart behind this verse, and how can I get that across? So again, very different translations. One is not right, one is not wrong. They're just coming at it from a different way, and it depends on what you, the reader, are trying to get out of that verse as to which one of those you might want to choose.
That's so interesting. So this, I guess, is for both of you. You know, you mentioned back when you were first translating, you used the NASB a lot. How often are you using translations in your daily life? What translations do you use? What do you use them for? What is your usage of translations now as people who are original language hobbyists?
Yeah, I mean, neither Greek nor Hebrew, you'll be surprised to know, are my first language. So they're not my native language. It's not how I read chunks of scripture. So if I'm going to devotionally read, I tend to do it out of an English translation. But if I'm really going to study and dig into a passage, I'm going to start with the Greek or the Hebrew. So I use translations if I'm going to read a large chunk and just try to grasp the large picture. And I have a couple of different translations that I use. I don't necessarily prefer, I guess what I'm trying to say is they're all good. They're all good in their own right for what they are trying to do. They do a great job. And so I benefit from all the different translations, and I benefit from comparing them. I mean, I have one that I default to, but mostly it's because that's what I grew up with, and that's fine. And I think the other thing I do that John and I do is when we are struggling with a passage and we're like, this doesn't make any sense. I can put the words together, but after that, how does it actually go together? We'll compare a bunch of different translations to see how other translators have put these together. Sometimes they're wildly different from one another because the text has so many variable possibilities. Other times it's very straightforward and we just missed an idiom or something like that. That's like, oh, I wish I would have known that was an idiom. That would have helped. But that's how I use them. John, I don't know about you.
Yeah, very similar. And I actually want to point out something that you mentioned briefly, and that's there's different kinds of reading. So like when I want to read devotionally, just for me and for my own soul, I probably gravitate toward the NIV. Like, I don't know, Josh, if that's the one you gravitate toward, but that's the one I grew up with. Yeah, and why the NIV? Well, because I have a nice hardback copy of the NIV, and I like what they made the pages out of, the material, and I like the font they chose. And that's kind of it. But if I want to study, okay, then it's all right. Let's dig out a few translations. One, actually, I'll just give a free. This is totally free, a resource that I use all the time. So for our listeners, if you want to start studying the Bible and going into more detail, just go to netbible.org, because it's a free study Bible, and there's got so much good information. If you're just like want to dip your toe into study, that's a great resource, totally free. You'll start learning about the languages, and it's got a complete commentary too. So I can't recommend that one enough. So that's often my first stop for studying, is to go to something like that.
So I don't know a lot about that translation, Net Bible. I mean, I've used it, but that is probably not a translation our listeners are super familiar with. Do either of you have any idea where that's from, or kind of where on that kind of spectrum that you described that one lands?
Yes, I don't know where it's from. I haven't looked that up. It's much more of a word for word translation, so it's not going to be as smooth as like the NIV. So definitely it's again more of a study resource than like maybe a devotional resource, but I actually don't know where it's from. I don't know if you would know that, Josh.
I don't use the Net Bible like you do. Every time you talk about it, I go, oh yeah, I really need to dig into that resource. But I just haven't yet.
I have used the translation, and I have the notes in the app that I use for the Bible, but this is my first time going to their website. This website is incredible. You can actually have the English in one column, the Greek in another column. And if you highlight a word in either column, it highlights it in the other column. So if I choose the Greek word, it tells me what the English word is. If I choose the English word, it tells me what the Greek word is in the opposite column. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like a free mini version of Logos, which is very, very expensive, and I don't own because it is so expensive.
Yeah,
so it's kind of like the freebie version of that, but still really high quality.
It's incredible. I am so excited to dig into this a little bit more.
Which, Josh, you just brought up a great point about equivalency. And what I think would accidentally get communicated is when you highlight a word in one language, it highlights the word in the other language. And it gives the impression that those two things mean the same thing. And I think the better reality, the better picture of that is to say these mean approximately the same thing. We're not going to be able to convey in many circumstances the precise definition of a Greek word by an English equivalent. It's going to be near equivalent. It's going to communicate some of the idea or most of the idea, depending on what words are chosen. Some things have almost near perfect equivalency, where others really, they could use 3 or 4 English words to really grasp the concept that lays behind a Greek word. And so I just don't want to accidentally tip somebody off and think, oh, these things mean the same thing. Like when we sit down and reread Merriam-Webster, we read a dictionary definition of a word that has sentences and concepts that spell out what a definition is. We don't open up Merriam-Webster and get a thesaurus. Like, it's not that any one word is equivalent to another. It's they're similar meanings.
That makes a ton of sense. And it raises, one of the kind of backdrop questions that I had wanted to ask and I skipped was, when you're thinking about translation, what are some of the issues at hand that you need to be intentional about? And one of them is this issue of one Greek word does not equal one English word. They're not equivalent. Are there other issues like that when we're looking at translations, or being mindful of the fact that the Bible is not in its original language that we need to be thinking about?
The issue that comes to mind immediately, and this is just one of them, would be our language, English, right now in the current day, the past, let's say 20, 30 years. We're moving from a very like masculine gender-based language to a gender-neutral language. And so our translations are starting to reflect that. So that's just something to know. And so if you're reading an older translation, for example, and you read Psalm 1 and it says, "Blessed is the man who does such and such," you need to have the historical context in your brain to sit back and say, okay, this is the NIV from 1981. Man there just means person. This person who wrote this psalm is not being sexist. It's just man meant person at that time. Today, if you look at newer versions, they're probably going to say something like, "Blessed is the person," or "Blessed are those who," in an attempt to kind of adjust to the changing language, the changing of English as a language. So that's just like one example of a thing to be aware of.
Well, and I would say the same is true of the original languages. The languages themselves, the Greek, Hebrew, they were always in a state of flux and a state of change. And so, John, you and I experienced this when we translated the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and then the very next thing we did was to translate Esther. And the writings of those two documents are separated by, I don't know, 1,500 years? Maybe not that long, 1,000 years. There's a significant amount of time for that language to have changed and evolved and be used differently. And so we had different constructions of words, and we had different meanings for words on occasion. Or I think about in Greek, at the time that the Bible was written, the time that the New Testament was written, things like the diminutive was being faded out. And so the diminutive, just like as a way of emphasizing the smallness of something. So in Revelation, when we see that the Lamb has appeared and it looks like the Lamb has been slaughtered, the word for lamb is the diminutive form of the word. And so it's literally translated the little lamb. However, the diminutive at this time was losing its significance. And so he could have meant just lamb. He wasn't really necessarily trying to emphasize the little lamb. Or maybe he was hearkening back to an older usage of that word. And we really have to wrestle through, what did the author mean by using this form at the state of the way the language was being used at that time?
What else? What other issues come up as you guys are translating together and trying to figure out what does the text mean?
I have a story. Can I share a story?
Absolutely. I
All
have
right.
heard that stories are an invaluable part of any podcast.
Well, I have a story that I'll share. This actually occurred literally, it was either yesterday or last week. I can't remember. So Josh and I are translating Psalm 82. And we came across this word in Hebrew. It's the word shaphat. And it's used 4 times in Psalm 82. And if you're a first-year Hebrew student, you will learn this word shaphat, and you will learn that it means to judge. But the problem is as Josh mentioned earlier, that's not a dictionary definition. That's a gloss to help with memorizing a vocabulary word. But the problem comes in with a psalm like Psalm 82 is we don't have the same meaning of the word to judge as the Hebrews had for shaphat. So for example, in verse 2, God is telling the divine council, he's asking them, he's like, why are you judging evildoers in court? You should be judging the poor. And as English speakers, you read that and go, that's backwards. What are you talking about, God? Like, you're not supposed, no, we're supposed to be judging the evildoers. We're not supposed to be judging the poor. That's because we have a negative connotation of that word judgment in English. But in Hebrew, it could have that same negative connotation. It could also have a positive connotation. So in verse 2, when God asks them, why are you judging evildoers in court? What he means by that is, why are you vindicating them? Why are you proclaiming them to be innocent in court? And then in verse 3, when he says you should judge the poor, again, it's that positive connotation. Why aren't you vindicating? Why aren't you defending the poor in court? So even something as simple as that back to our original idea of translations, we don't have a word in English that means to judge someone positively. Or if we do, I don't know it. And Josh, we couldn't think of it together. So now we're, by necessity, having to choose a phrase or different ways to say that again, there's not a one-to-one correlation between shafat in Hebrew and judge in English. And this is an example where we kind of sat there and scratched our heads for a minute and we're like, what do you mean we're supposed to be judging the poor? That makes no sense. So we go to the lexicon and start looking at all the definitions and the semantic field of the word, which is the fancy way to say all the things it can mean. And that's where we find out, oh, that's actually quite a bit wider of a range than I thought it was.
Yeah. And so to close that off, my translation did not use the word judge or any one word gloss. And so when you talk about, my translation is very literal. I'm going to one-for-one translation. Such a thing doesn't exist because you can't bring across the meaning of a word every time with one single English word. And so the way I ended up translating that is, how long will you defend the rights of the unjust? So that defending the rights of was the best way I could get across this idea of positive judgment.
Yeah, this is one of the things I'm really struck by as I listen to both of you guys talk about this particular example is, if I'm being honest, I think I generally default to assuming a translation that claims to be word for word is generally better than a thought for thought or paraphrase in terms of actually knowing what the Bible is, quote unquote, really saying. But part of what I'm hearing you say is there's actually something deceptive about even the language that we use for translations of word for word translation, because of this idea that their words don't match our words. And so sometimes it actually could straitjacket you in a way that makes you miss the meaning to try to go word for word in the way that you translate. And you actually might get a more accurate translation by going thought for thought. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes, I would say that.
I think that's true sometimes. I think it depends on the honestly on the verse in question,
Sure.
Just because of the nuances of Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and English. So I think there's some truth to that. If you want to take that to an extreme, you could come to a false conclusion if you went too far down the word for word route. But I think you could also potentially come to a false conclusion if you went too far down the thought for thought route. I don't think it's an either or thing.
Yeah.
And
so this is, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, you were asking earlier about the different issues that you have in translation. Mm-hmm. And I think we've harped a lot on this thought for thought versus word for word kind of dichotomy, which is true. But I think you also have another layer of decisions that you have to make when you're translating. And that is, to what degree do I try to make this clear to the audience? And a perfect example of that is something that I experienced while helping prep sermons at my church. And in John 19:40, they talk about Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea taking down the body of Jesus and cleaning it up and preparing it for burial. And the Greek literally just says they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths. It was just like a plural form of the verb. And so that literally could point to any group of more than one person. And so does it mean that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea personally took Jesus' body off the cross? Or we know that these folks were rather wealthy and they had servants and people that did things for them. Did they have their servants take down the body of Jesus? And so they could point to either one. And so some translations just leave it as they and leave it vague. Others try to be more clear because they think that they clearly points to Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. And so it says the two of them. And so the NIV translates the two of them for they. I don't think that's wrong. I think it's trying to bring clarity for the reader. But in the process of trying to bring clarity, they have made a choice. They've made a choice as to what they refers to. And you have thousands and thousands of these little minute choices about how to bring something across and how clear to be versus how vague to be in your translations.
So you're not even just talking about stylistically, are we going to use good English, which is what I thought you were going to talk about at first. You're really talking about this idea of vague or specific. How much do we drill into what this might mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I've got a quote that actually speaks to this. One of the books I scanned over again, having read it in the past, before this conversation, was How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, which is a great book, by the way. And they actually have a chapter 2, on translations of the Bible. And so they say, to Josh's point, the very fact that you are reading God's word in translation means that you are already involved in interpretation, and that's true whether you like it or not. And so to Josh's point, you can't get away from the interpretive question, whether you're doing it or you're having an expert do it in the case of translation. But to Josh's point, these are real questions that anyone translating the Bible has to struggle with and make decisions on. And again, it's not good, bad, right, wrong. It's just knowing that is a truth about how translation works.
Yeah, so this all leads me to the practical question that I often wrestle with. Let's say I pick a couple of translations. I have the ESV and the NIV, or the NET and the NLT sitting side by side. And again, I don't want to say one's doing it right and one's doing it wrong, but they are both nuancing a particular verse differently. And I'm trying to figure out what to do with that. What advice would you two give in terms of sort of, I don't want this to turn into, I just get to pick which one I think is right. Because like you said, both of these have really intelligent groups of scholars who know a heck of a lot more than I do behind them. So what do I do with this when I'm sitting here and reading these two translations that nuance things differently? What questions do I ask? How do I treat them?
That's a really good question. I suppose that's the $62,000 question. The best answer that I have is, if you get in a situation where, and by the way, I want to make sure our listeners are clear, this is not like a usual occurrence, right? The vast majority of the Bible is pretty darn clear. There's not a ton of questions about what it means, but there are spots where you have to make decisions. And when you come to those spots, if you're reading in more of a study manner as opposed to a devotional manner, I would say go find some good commentaries and see what the commentators have to say. Commentators are a wonderful tool because they know the language and they can explain it to you. And a good commentary will give you all of the major options and pros and cons, and then that gives you a lot more information to make a sound decision.
That's a great point. We are never doing this in a vacuum.
Right. Yeah, we're never doing this in a vacuum, which also means live human people that we can go reach out to. Reach out to somebody who knows Greek or Hebrew. Reach out to your pastor who has some of those commentaries and can explain them to you. Some of them are written at a very high level, and even if you grab one, you're going to be very lost in the academic debates that they are addressing. And so ask somebody who has these commentaries and has read them and can explain it in plain speak instead of scholar speak. But then I would also just broaden the circle a little bit in terms of the number of translations you're comparing. One of my favorite resources is Bible Hub, and you can drill in on a verse and it will display 10, 12, I don't know how many different major translations and how they translate these. And so if you catch a difference of translation between, say, the NIV or the NLT, then, expand your view, see what a variety of different translations are doing. It might help you see the problem in a new light because you might have 3 or 4 different options, or you might have a very stark 2 options, and here's what we're wrestling with. So then you know exactly what question you're asking. So I think that that's helpful. But at the end of the day, I want to reiterate something that Jon said. If you were to do that on 95% of the verses in the Bible and just look at the 10 most major translations we have in English and compare them, you're not going to find meaningful differences among them. We have very, very good translations, and you're not really going to go wrong with any of the major translations. Now, you might get a little sideways with things like the Passion Translation or something like that, but the NIV, the NLT, the New Revised Standard Version, the ESV, all of these are very good options, and you're not going to see huge differences among them for most verses.
Yeah, this really had me thinking. I hadn't thought about this before until I was listening to what you said, Jon, and then how you followed up, Josh. If I'm looking at 2 translations and they seem to be in opposition, or they're translating differently, I may want my first question to be, where is the overlap here? How do these harmonize together? Because it may be that they are actually closer than my first glance. Is that possibly true? Like, does that make sense? It may be that they are coloring different elements, but consistent with one another.
Yeah, I would say that could be true. I mean, if you take it, so the word that popped into my head when you said that is the Hebrew word chesed, which means covenantal love within a covenant. As you might imagine, we do not have an English word to describe that, but it encompasses mercy and grace and loving kindness and love and kindness. And it just goes on and on. You could probably pick 20 words. And so it could be that your translation says God's loving kindness, and another translation says God's mercy, and you go, wait, those aren't the same thing. Well, they're parts of the whole in that particular case. We just don't have a word that is as all-encompassing in English as chesed is in Hebrew.
Yes, I agree. So I think you need to leave the option open that these could be, to borrow an analogy, different parts of the elephant that we're all describing. However, there are times when it is clearly a translation choice, and it's not necessarily the exact same thing. Not that you need to doubt your translations. It's just that this interpreter, right? I'm already tipping my hat here. Translator, who is also by nature an interpreter, has made this choice, and this interpreter has made this choice. And so we have before us 2 choices on how we can understand the meaning of this phrase. And that might mean that they can be harmonized, and it might mean we literally do need to choose between these.
Man, so, I guess as we get ready to wrap up here, I want to end, and we've hit on this a couple of different times, but can I trust the translations that I have? If they're different, if they're the same, if they seem to be interpreting, if I am forced to acknowledge that there is an interpreter between me and the Bible, and that is the translator, can I still trust it?
Unequivocally, yes. And
yes.
I say that because the Bible itself has this reality built into it. When most New Testament authors are quoting the Old Testament, they are quoting a translation. They are quoting the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And so the Bible itself is a book in translation. God is sovereign enough to author the original documents, to preserve its transmission over the centuries and to preserve his word in translation. It doesn't mean we're off the hook and we just get to do whatever we want. There's a lot of hard work involved, but there are a lot of wonderful scholars that have done that hard work with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And just like it was true that the New Testament authors can quote the Old Testament in translation, and it can be part of God's holy word, we can trust the translation process today.
So good. Other thoughts from you, Jon?
I'm just glad that Josh brought up the Holy Spirit, because he is definitely a major contributor to the translation process, whether it's the folks that did the NIV or Josh and me sitting down and doing it. So yeah, have faith in the Holy Spirit. Obviously, that doesn't mean we're going to become infallible, but he is there to guide us.
So good. Well, boy, before we wrap up, Jon, you knew what we were going to talk about today. Whenever I'm talking to somebody who knows more about a subject than I do, I always want to make sure, is there anything else you were planning on saying and didn't get a chance to say? I want to give you a kind of open-ended chance to share anything else you were thinking about this topic.
The only thing I think of, and we've kind of touched on it, the thought that occurred to me was, for your devotional reading, when it's your quiet time, or if you don't like that term, then just sitting down and reading the Bible for your own personal reasons, just choose a good translation and it will be okay. If you want to take an additional step and begin to do a little more academic study, then I would jump to 2 or 3 translations and maybe learn a little bit about commentaries and dig more into the Greek and Hebrew. But it just depends. Yeah, it just depends on what you're trying to get out of it and what your reasonings and rationale are. And I hope that's a little bit of guidance for folks out there.
Man, I think that's so good.
I would add one last piece, and that is learning Greek and Hebrew is not impossible. You can do it. And if that is something that you want to do and you've always thought about doing, oh my gosh, we are in a resource-rich environment. There are so many avenues to learning these languages, and it doesn't have to cost you a lot. It might not even cost you much of anything, but it will take a lot of time and a lot of hard work, but it is by no means impossible, and nor is it meant just for the scholars. I think the average person in the pew can, and in some cases should, be able to read the original languages. So, I mean, with that said, though, I would love to just turn to the audience and say, what is your experience with different translations? Do you have one that you use consistently? Why do you love it? Is it as simple as it has really good binding and good font? Or I grew up with it, or it's the one my church uses? Or what's your experience with different translations? And what's something that you've been inspired to do by listening to this conversation? What's the next step that you want to take in really understanding your Bible a little bit deeper? So we would love to know that. And if there's something we did not get to on this podcast episode that you would like answers to, by all means, reach out to us. You can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Facebook, and you can email us at onthephonewithjosh@gmail.com. We would love to get you resources or answers to your questions, or maybe even have another podcast episode about this. So we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, this is the moment where we usually have a thoughts segment, but because we have an honored guest, we want to turn the tables and ask you, Jon Clemence, what have you been thinking about?
Well, I'm going to turn the tables back on you, because what I've been thinking about is your podcast. Ooh. I have to tell you the story. Ooh. My wife and I just listened to your show on the 6 stages of spiritual growth, or the journey of the Christian life. And it was very impactful for us, because if you listen to the episode, you know, a lot of us in the church environments that we grow up in stop at the 3rd stage, and then we end up hitting the wall and we don't know what to do. And we think there's something wrong with us, or there's something wrong with the faith. And we begin to deconstruct and feel disoriented and lonely. So for us to sit down together and listen to your episode on that and realize, oh, there's a wall, there's a stage 4, there's a stage 5, there's a stage 6. Oh my gosh, I had no idea. And so for us to be able to orient ourselves and say, oh, I think we're going through the wall, or I think I might be in stage 4, or this makes so much sense to me now. I have a matrix and I can start to understand my experience a little better, was really a cool moment for both of us. It was encouraging. We felt supported. We felt like someone knew what we were going through. And so I just want to say, just on the behalf of me and my wife, how much we really appreciated that episode that you guys did, and how thankful we are for you and your ability to speak into our lives, even if you didn't know you were doing it.
Man, well, thank you very much. That's incredible.
You're welcome.
It makes me realize that as we record today, the next episode that launches actually today is a continuation of that same conversation. So, and we actually named it Deconstruction. And so I'd be interested to know what you think of the continuation episode as well.
I will listen to it.
Man, so we would normally now switch into a Which Josh moment, but I would rather, again, focus on you, Jon. And you have some interesting things that you do that might be of interest to our listeners. And so we just wanted to give you a chance to share a little bit about what you do.
Yeah. So I'm a professional nerd. And so let me tell you what that means. I'm actually in my day job. I don't translate the Bible, although that would be pretty cool if I did. But to get money and to pay my bills, I am a professional editor and a professional writer. So what that means is if you own a business, or if you're an entrepreneur and you have written content, whether that be a blog or a newsletter or books or ebooks, and you need help either writing or editing that work to really take it from a good enough level to an excellent level, to really showcase your expertise, that's what I do. So if anyone is in that boat and says, I do have content that I write, I could use some help making it stand out, making it shine in a sea of mediocrity, I would say reach out to me. And the best way to do that is to go to cedarpressproofreading.com. And there's a little button on every single page that says book a call. And you can sit down and have a conversation with me, just like I'm doing with Josh and Josh. And if you want to talk about Greek and Hebrew, that's fine. But if you'd rather talk about your business and what I can do to help you, that's cool too. So again, cedarpressproofreading.com. You can learn all about me.
And I will add to that little commercial because not only are you amazing at what you do, both on the writing and the editing fronts, but your wife is also incredibly talented, and she also helps content stand out. Can you talk briefly about what she does and how she really helps people along?
Yeah, so she handles the other side of content, which is graphic design. So she's a professional freelance graphic design artist, has done some amazing work for some pretty big clients. So again, if you have that need in your business, we can help out with that too. And you know what? You can actually get a hold of her just by booking a call with me, and I will make sure that she gets that information.
That's awesome. So I'm just envisioning that call starting and somebody being like, no, I didn't want to talk to you. I want to talk to your wife. But that's amazing. So you guys really, in terms of helping people get themselves out there, you are able to cover every aspect of that, from words to pictures and everything. That's incredible.
Yeah, that's true.
So cool. Well, man, thank you for being here today. I am so grateful. I'm actually, I took a bunch of notes, but I'm also looking forward to actually getting to go back and re-listen to this, because you guys both had a lot of real wisdom to offer, and I am grateful for your perspective, and I will look forward to the next time we get to do something like this. So, Jon, thank you for your time. We are so grateful for you.
Man, I had a blast. Invite me back anytime. I'll come and talk about whatever you want to talk about, just to hang out with you guys.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Jon. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, again, thanks, Jon. We'll talk to you later.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.